If they won't hand over the water, they'll just take it. So what's the Army for? Not far from the United States, right here on the edge of a Mexican city, there's something worth taking. It doesn't look like much, just a huge empty lot, just a patch of land, but it's a special one. And an entire state's survival depends on it. And this is exactly where the U.S. wants to take something from Mexico and send it into Arizona straight across the border. Billions of tons of salty water. And here's why they want it. Look, in Arizona, if you drive south across the sandy flats and past dry ravines, you take it all in and think, yeah, desert. Water would be nice here, though it's not even clear what for. And then you lift your eyes from the road. And then you suddenly see fields flooded with vivid shades of green, and you're like, wait, what? Everything around is scorched. Dust, rocks, heat, and here it's like someone switched to a different state. The contrast is unreal. Arizona actually grows a lot, but that's not the main point. Most of the state's income comes from cotton and hay, but here's the catch. Those crops require too much water. So the question is, where does the water come from? Out here, there's basically none. See that? Nothing. The nearest source is way over there. Let's take a ruler. This is a full 186 miles. Now zoom in and look right here, the Colorado River. They pump the water through the Central Arizona Project Canal. And not just that one. Until recently, people thought it would solve Arizona's water problem once and for all. Except now it's no longer enough. Arizona is almost out of its own water. The local supply you can just tap at home from groundwater or from the Colorado. And that's why the idea of taking water from Mexico grabbed everyone's attention. Because it's no longer, yeah, droughts happen. This is a statewide, full-on alarm. Here's how it works. Arizona basically has two main sources of water. The first is groundwater, the second is the Colorado River. And right now, both are in trouble. On one side, there's drought. On the other, the entire system is stretched to the limit. Demand keeps climbing, cities are growing, farms aren't going anywhere, the heat is worse, evaporation is higher. It's a long list of factors. Then June 2023 hits. Arizona officials come out and say, in the Phoenix area, there isn't enough groundwater to support future housing development, meaning this isn't a maybe someday problem, it's happening now. The projects are already approved. The neighborhoods are drawn up. Developers are ready to build. But the water for all of it isn't there. The problem is, even what used to be considered a reliable reserve is no longer reliable. And if there isn't enough water even for homes that have already been approved, what happens next is the state keeps growing. Because it will. Since the start of the mega drought back in 2000, the state's population has grown by nearly 50%. 50. That's basically a whole new Arizona in terms of people. And so far, there's no sign that growth is slowing down. And here's the paradox. You'd think a desert would drive people away because, well, it's a desert. But it doesn't, and people keep coming. Cities keep spreading, and new neighborhoods are popping up where there was nothing but sand not long ago. And it's not just Arizona. States that rely on the Colorado River have posted some of the fastest growth rates in the country for years. In fact, in 2018, Phoenix, here it is, the state capital, set a record for population growth. All of that might be fine if it weren't for water. Because while all of this is happening, Arizona's also stuck in a drought. Such a severe one that scientists say it's the worst in the U.S. Southwest in roughly the past 1,200 years. And you know what's strangest? None of this seems to be stopping anyone. People keep coming. But what happens next? So the problem's obvious now, but there's no clear solution. The state has put forward the biggest water supply projects you could imagine. 7 proposals aimed at creating new sources of water. And one of them basically says, take water from Mexico. The thing is, it's salty, so it would have to be desalinated first and only then used. Desalination would be handled by the Israeli company IDE Technologies. These aren't some random guys. IDE builds desalination plants all over the world and then operates and maintains them. They've done roughly 450 projects, so they know how to make this work reliably. According to the plan, Arizona would buy up to 325 billion gallons of water per year from the plant. That sounds abstract, so here's the normal person version. It should be enough for about 3 million households. Arizona has around 2.6 million households right now, so in theory, that's more than enough. Even though they'd start at about 98 billion gallons per year. But how do you physically get that water across the border and through the desert? unless you're planning to annex a chunk of Mexico, of course. The first leg of the route is on the Mexican side. The plan calls for 4 pumps there. Their job is to lift the water along that stretch and keep it moving. They're expected to run mostly on solar power and batteries, so this isn't a plug it into the grid and forget about it setup. The pumps have to work on what the desert provides every day, sun. Next, the water has to be stored somewhere, otherwise any breakdown turns into a disaster. That's why they want to build a reservoir in Arizona near Phoenix, enough to last about 4 days. And here's the key point. They're not going to send this water down a separate standalone route. They want to tie it into what already exists. The project documentation explicitly includes a connection to the Central Arizona project. That's the same canal you're looking at, the one that already moves Colorado River water across the state. The idea is for the new water to merge into the existing system and then keep flowing through the same canals. So what we've got here isn't just a couple of pumps, it's an attempt to plug a new lifeline into Arizona. And without using weapons, by the way. But there's one important detail. IDE already operates desalination facilities on U.S. soil. For example, this plant in Carlsbad, California, it's up and running. It produces water, and it's often cited as proof that desalination is real, not some science fiction. And overall, desalination plants aren't exactly exotic in the U.S. anymore. They're already fairly common in certain states, California, Texas, and Florida. And you know what they all have in common? A long coastline and access to the ocean or a bay, meaning there's actually somewhere you can build a plant like this. Seawater is close, the infrastructure is close, and the logistics are straightforward. Now let's look at Arizona, and you'll see one big problem. The state has no access to the ocean. Arizona is landlocked. It has desert, towns, farms, everything except an oceanfront. The nearest major body of water to the south is the Gulf of California, but between Arizona and that Gulf is Mexico. Specifically, this Mexican state, Sonora. And it's not part of the United States. And this is where things get truly strange, almost absurd. The very city where they want to build this plant is already struggling with water shortages. From the sea, Puerto Penasco looks like a postcard, exactly like a resort ad that's trying to lure you in. But step a little farther from the beach and reality hits. Roughly a third of the population lives in poverty and doesn't have enough safe drinking water. In the summer, it gets even worse. Tourists arrive by the thousands, water use spikes, and the pressure in the pipes drops. At some point, the water may stop running properly altogether. People end up living by the rule of whatever you manage to store is what you've got, with people depending on water tanks. And this is the city where they plan to build a plant to produce drinking water so it can be shipped somewhere else, to Arizona, across the desert, into another country. It's a real paradox. A place where people are short on water is planning to export water. That doesn't sound fair. Of course, IDE realizes you can't just leave locals with nothing. The Israeli company said that as part of the proposal, it would provide Puerto Penasco with drinking water. But they gave no specifics, no volumes, no pricing. And it's not just one resort. The plan says other cities in the region are supposed to receive some of the water too. Hermosillo, Sonoita, Nogales. So basically, they're talking about a large system, one coastal plant supplying not only Arizona, but also northern Mexico. But here's a less obvious question. Won't all this make things worse for Mexico? Because desalination isn't magic. It's not, we took seawater, turned it into drinking water, problem solved. It's a massive engineering grinder that only works at scale. In short, it goes like this. Seawater is drawn in by the huge volume, then forced under high pressure through membranes that filter out the salt. You end up with 2 products. Stay with me. Out of every 100 gallons of seawater, you get about 50 gallons of drinking water and another 50 gallons of brine. In other words, a super salty concentrate where the salt content is roughly twice that of normal seawater. And that brine has to go somewhere. IDE would dump it back into the sea, and in theory that sounds fine. Out in the open ocean, the discharged brine really can dilute quickly. But we're not talking about the open ocean. The Gulf of California is long and narrow, and because of that shape, salt can actually build up in the northern end instead of dissipating. And that's exactly where the world's most endangered marine mammal lives. This tiny porpoise called the vaquita doesn't exist anywhere else, only in the northern Gulf of California, and estimates say there are around 10 left in the wild. That's not even on the brink. That's basically 1 foot in the grave. Well, 1 fin. And then this plant shows up, something that could change the water salinity and affect everything alive in the bay, starting with plankton. And plankton, by the way, is basically the foundation of the entire food chain. Without it, everything goes off the rails. Fishing deal's another blow. Building and running the plant could put one of Mexico's most productive fishing grounds at risk. Local fishermen are already worried the fallout will be catastrophic because the water will, in the nicest possible sense of the word, move to the U.S., while the environmental consequences stay right here in Mexico. And once again, it feels unfair to say the least. IDE, of course, says everything is totally under control. Relax. The project lead, Erez Hoder-Ishe, claims that dumping the brine won't harm marine life. What's more, he even suggests the brine could be beneficial, pointing that near other desalination plants, life is thriving. Sounds great. But when you've got only 10 individuals of a rare animal left in the Gulf, sounds great doesn't reassure anyone. At that point, you need absolute certainty. Even if you imagine they built the plant, desalinated the water, and somehow managed not to destroy the sea, that's still not even half the story. Because producing the water isn't enough. You still have to deliver it. And for that water to flow into Arizona at all, you'd need a whole new major system. Basically a brand new aqueduct. That's a serious engineering challenge, almost a separate project inside the project. The water would have to travel about 200 miles and climb more than 2,000 feet to reach Phoenix. In other words, pumps would be pushing it uphill against the terrain pretty much the entire way, for most of the route. And don't forget it would have to cross an international border. Still, the whole let's run a canal through the Arizona desert idea isn't totally crazy. It's practically a time-honored tradition. I mean, they've been down this road before more than once. Artificial water canals have been a part of Arizona for a long time, because without them, the whole state would look completely different. Over the past century, and then some, just one valley alone has gained 9 major canals, and the Arizona Canal is the longest in the system. It stretches over 37 miles. From here, water is routed into other canals on the north side of the Salt River. There are also hundreds of smaller waterways connected to the main canals, like capillaries that carry water into specific neighborhoods to irrigate fields, for example, or so you can wash your hands. And the scale of it all is enormous. The total length of drainage and lateral canals is about 1,056 miles. More than 85% of them have been put into pipes. Not open water, but hidden away because, hey, it's still desert out here. And the system keeps growing. Every year, new pipes are laid or new stretches are lined because more and more areas are being developed. Roughly 180 miles of canals run through Phoenix alone. That's more than twice the combined canal length of Venice and Amsterdam. Over there, canals are about romance, little boats, and pretty bridges. Here, canals provide irrigation and drinking water for an entire metropolis and make it possible for millions of people to live in a sun-scorched desert. If we're being completely honest, the canals are one of the main reasons Phoenix exists in the first place. They were here long before the United States and Mexico even existed. When Phoenix's founder, Jack Swilling, looked out over the Salt River in 1867, he didn't see empty desert. He saw the traces of old irrigation canals, remains of a massive system built long before Europeans arrived. So he simply began clearing those clogged ditches, bringing back life to something that had already worked once. That network was constructed by the ancestors of today's Salt River, Pima, Maricopa, and Gila River communities. They were farmers who lived here about 1,400 years ago. Their canals stretched for hundreds of miles and could supply water to tens of thousands of people. And many modern canals in Arizona still follow those same routes. But if we return to the idea of a brand new canal, the American side runs into problems immediately, big ones. Because a new pipeline would mean carving out a corridor as wide as a highway and running it through protected land, a U.S. national monument and a UNESCO site created specifically to safeguard a fragile desert ecosystem. Between Puerto Penasco and Phoenix lies one of Arizona's most vulnerable areas, about 500 square miles of desert along the state's southern edge, home to extremely rare species. And the pipeline would cut straight through the middle of it. What makes this even worse is that the area has already been harmed. The construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall dealt the ecosystem a serious blow. Now they're proposing to cram a pipeline in there too? And those aren't even all the complications. For the Tohono O'odham people, this land isn't just environmentally important, it's spiritually sacred. They lived here for thousands of years before being pushed onto a reservation. In their beliefs, every saguaro cactus, those enormous giants, is also an embodiment of the human spirit. And to lay the pipeline, they'd have to destroy a huge number of those cacti. So yeah, we need the water, but is there really no gentler way to do this? All right, all is clear when it comes to the ecology and the pipes. The Indigenous community too, sadly, that can't be ignored. But there's one more downside, and it's usually the one that hits hardest. The price. This water is going to be insanely expensive. According to the estimates, the project would deliver fresh water at nearly 10 times the cost of what Arizona currently gets from the Colorado River. And that's not even counting the long-term energy and maintenance costs to run this whole monster. It'll keep draining money year after year. State Senator Lisa Atondo, for example, has said the price could reach $3,000 or more per acre foot. That's about $2.43 per 264 gallons. A lot, a whole lot. Is all this worth the investment? Hard to say. It's still unclear how this project fits into the state's long-term future, but unlike some other states, Arizona doesn't have a single statewide plan for water supply. So people are debating a multi-billion-dollar mega project, but it feels like there's no shared roadmap showing where it's all supposed to lead. In theory, the plant would be financed by IDE with private money. But in exchange, the company would want a rock-solid guarantee. Arizona must buy this water for the next 100 years. Now that's long-term planning. Must be nice. And the final version of the agreement could easily include another unpleasant clause. Arizona would have to pay even when it doesn't actually need the water from the plant, simply because that's what the contract says. That's happened before with desalination facilities in California. And there's one more thing that's easy to forget when you hear desalination: energy. Desalination consumes an enormous amount of it. Massive pumps, high pressure, membranes, constant operation, and it all has to run 24/7. That's why IDE proposes an additional piece of the project: build one of the largest solar power plants in America, not far from Phoenix, then run a transmission line to send that electricity into Mexico to the plant. But then we're back to the land problem again. The transmission line would require a cleared corridor about 150 feet wide. The pipeline would need even more, about 175 feet, and yes, the power line would cut through the same fragile area we talked about earlier. A desert with protected species, conservation status, and saguaro cacti. Are there any real alternatives? Or is the only way forward to drag a pipeline across the desert and sign up for a 100-year water deal? Basically, there are two paths. The first is to bring water in from somewhere else, for example, through pipelines from other states. Some people say we need to build a plant in Puerto Penasco, and fast. The clock is ticking. The Colorado River is dropping. There's less and less water in the canal, and at some point it could simply run too low to rely on. Others push back. Hold on, why jump straight to Mexico? In theory, Arizona could pipe water in from the west from California, or even from the east from the Missouri River, hundreds of miles away. Yes, it sounds just as insane, but at least those ideas don't run headfirst into an international border and treaty law. And then there are environmentalists offering a second option, one that people don't like. Don't import more water, but finally start living within what we've got. Protect what we have. Cut back on lawns and swimming pools, and maybe even on the number of homes. Because once water becomes scarce, affordable housing in the desert starts to sound like a pretty strange concept. So what can we do right now without waiting for some giant mega project to come online? For starters, look at agriculture. Irrigated farming uses more than 70% of Arizona's water. 70! And a big chunk of that farmland is still watered by flood irrigation. Basically, they pump water out and just release it onto the field so it spreads across the surface. Can you imagine how much gets wasted? Especially when drip irrigation is already there. With drip systems, water is delivered straight to the roots through plastic tubing. If Arizona switched to that, the savings would be insane. But cities have it even worse. In Arizona, households sometimes spend up to 70% of their indoor water budget not on showers or cooking, but on lawns and landscaping. In other words, a huge share of the water goes toward making the desert look like a postcard suburb. So yeah, there is an alternative. It's just more complicated than building a plant, which is funny because you'd think nothing could be more complicated than turning salt water into drinking water. So where does that leave things? Back in 2022, officials in Pinal County were among the loudest supporters of the desalination plant. Their farmers had the most to lose. Local agriculture brings in more than $1 billion a year and relies directly on groundwater, supplies that are being depleted at an alarming rate. IDE was saying at the time that the plant could be up and running by the end of 2027, but the plan stalled. The project has been postponed indefinitely, and at this point the company still has to win the bid in the first place. And that's where the political headaches began. Just what we needed, right? In Mexico, some lawmakers are very wary of the idea. It's still unclear whether the state and federal authorities will back the agreement and whether they'll agree to build a huge amount of supporting infrastructure. Officials say they want to review other proposals as well. In the end, something will probably happen, but that's exactly why no one is rushing. Approving one project right away would scare off competitors, so they'll drag out the decision for as long as they can. I looked up the latest updates. The most recent one in this story is from November 2025. Arizona's decided to spend taxpayer money so private companies can draw up plans for at least 2, possibly 3 desalination projects at different sites, stretching from California down to Mexico. But no one's promising water tomorrow. The earliest possible start is 2028, and realistically, it's more like the early to mid-2030s. Bottom line, Arizona's going to do everything it can, because it's running out of options. Arizona isn't backing down. The state will keep pushing the idea of new massive projects meant to fix the water deficit because it needs a new source of water. There's no way around that. Inside Arizona, there's barely anything left to extract without serious consequences, and the most interesting part is plans like this don't even shock people here, because Arizona has done things that once sounded insane. This is where the Colorado River was dammed and the Hoover Dam was built. And later, they basically created an artificial river, a huge water corridor running from Lake Havasu to Tucson, climbing uphill for nearly 300 miles. That's the Central Arizona Project. Back then, it sounded like a bold, almost impossible move. And now it's just part of everyday life like roads or the power grid. And that's the Arizona mindset. They've been doing the impossible for more than a century, so they'll do it again. And you owe me a like. See you later.